Good morning. It's nice to be back at the McNay. I've been here with docents one other time, talking about underwear, which unfortunately is what everybody knows me for. If I were ever going to have a tombstone, it would say something about underwear on it. How embarrassing. But I'm so happy to be with a group of what must be some of the most well-versed and well-educated docents anywhere. I hope all of you got to hear Annette Becker on Wednesday. She is absolutely a terrific speaker, and I'm glad that was on Wednesday and I didn't have to immediately follow her. You're also very fortunate to have that amazing exhibit. And I have to admit that when I was first asked to give a talk for this, and I heard about the 90s exhibit, I thought, oh, because I couldn't think of anything in the 90s that really was very appealing. And then I got to see the exhibit Tuesday night, and there is extraordinary designs in there. So you're really lucky to be able to interact with that and work with that. Seeing it also made me readjust my talk just a bit. As my title suggests, high fashion is over, done with. It all comes from the street now. But as this exhibit clearly demonstrates, that is not the case. Fashion can come from both on high, with couture design, and from the people. And that makes for a very interesting fashion scene that all kinds of people can participate in. And wider participation is always a good thing. What distinguishes fashion from just clothing? There's one factor that really makes that distinction between just clothing and fashion. And what is that? Style. Right. You can have style without fashion. Chicness. Creativity. Originality. You have all of that and anything else. It's change. That's what marks fashion. You know, things go in and out of fashion. And oh my goodness, that has been so speeded up that it is barely possible to keep up with what is in fashion today. A change in appearance based upon a new aesthetic is what designates fashion, not just a functional change in appearance because the locust ate up all the cotton or something like that. Now, where do these new looks come from? I think most of us of a certain age remember when fashion designers truly did set the look of a decade or of a period. The elite, those who had the wherewithal and the desire to follow fashion, bought the newest, and then the rest of us tried to copy them in some way, whether it was be through the rack, off-the-rack imitations or sewing our own versions. Copying the look of the elite has a long history, whomever that elite might be at that time, whether it be kings and queens, actresses, people in power, and now apparently the latest influencer is some tweenager on TikTok or some such. But where did some of these changes among the elite come from in the past? The Silk Road. The Silk Road was important from 200 BC when it began in China until the 18th century when sea travel really overcame the benefits of overland travel. So many wonderful things were exchanged along this long route, from amber and lapis to silks and Tyrian purple, the dye, a royal color only used by the elite because of its rarity. And it comes from this little sea snail. And it's the secretion, and you can imagine how much secretion it takes to be able to dye an entire garment. Wars, sadly, can be a source of new fashions from the influence of an invader or conqueror, but also out of political expedience. We all know Paris is the center of fashion, and it was no different during the French Revolution. These fashions that you see are an early example of inspiration literally coming from the streets. A new accessory, the cockade, which is this little ribbon piece showing the French colors, was actually mandated by law at one point. But the Phrygian cap, the little pointed cap that you see that can be traced back to Roman times and is a symbol of liberty, but it was a choice. One also could choose to wear pantaloons, long pants, such as those worn by working men, instead of breeches, those knee-length forms that were worn by the aristocracy. And that was a choice, but if you did choose that, you had a better chance of having your head remain attached to your neck. This is a painting by Louis Lepel-Bolet showing an idealized fighter for freedom. He wears the red cap of liberty. He wears a carmagnole, a short woolen or cloth jacket of a dark color, and it was cut rather like a smock. And smocks were what were worn by working men at that time. Additionally, the trousers are shown in a patriotic color and worn with clogs or sabots, again, a symbol of the working people. These garments moved into the realm of fashion by the end of the Revolution, and men never went back to those knee breeches except for formal or court occasions. Exchange of women often brought fashion change. In this particular case, you're looking at Princess Irene of Hungary, who married into the royal family in the Byzantine time. And she wore long braids, and when she brought those long braids, they then became a fashion statement. New fashions today frequently come from entertainers, and that happened in the past also. Now, for centuries, Koreans have worn a set of garments called hanbok, and that just refers to the top and the bottom, the pants for men and a skirt for the women. Excuse me. And this started about in the 16th century, and originally the jacket for women was about hip length. And over the centuries, it gradually crept to the bottom line, gradually crept upwards till about waist length. But in the mid-19th century, a young entertainer wore an organza version of this little jacket, which was cut extremely short, barely covering her breasts. And although it was quite shocking to the observers, that jacket has never gone down since then and has remained at that upper level. So musicians were not highly ranked at this period, so this is an early example of fashion coming from the lower ranks, not from the upper. For hundreds of years, changes in appearance were primarily a result of these kinds of forces. Although there were certainly individuals who created all of these clothes, we have very little information on any individual designer or even seamstress or tailor. The individual we must think, excuse me, the individual that we must think of as actually putting into effect those changes, but we don't know about them. It's not until the 18th century and the reign of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette that the first fashion designers emerge. Obviously, there had been other designers, but we simply don't know about them. Finally, we do have a name. This lovely young woman is Rose Bertin, and she started out as a milliner, but very soon opened a shop in Paris in 1773 with large windows filled with displays of bonnets, shawls, fans, silk flowers, feathers. And once inside, and it was called the Grand Mogul, and that's sort of referring to the exoticism of the East. Excuse me. Once inside, the customer found herself in a luxurious setting surrounded by vast quantities of trims and ornamentations. Now, surface decoration in the 18th century was more important even than the gown itself and the cut of the gown, which remains pretty much the same. But oh, all of those furbelows that decorated it changed immensely and were extremely intricate. Bertine had an inventory of gowns produced by male guild members who are the ones who controlled the actual construction of gowns. And these gowns were just waiting to be embellished by Bertine and her staff. Bertine had many loyal and royal customers, but Marie Antoinette became her most important one in several ways. She not only designed the Queen's wardrobe and overall appearance, but she became a personal friend, which came back to bite poor Marie Antoinette in the rear, because having a friend from the trade was not of benefit in some people's eyes. And her name is known in history because of her association with the doomed young queen. Initially, she actually worked on the young queen's hair, building les poufs, an amazing hairstyle designed by Rose's friend, Monsieur Leonard. It was built on a scaffolding made from wire, cloth, gauze, horsehair, fake hair, and then whatever hair the woman had of her own was then mixed in with it, and it was all pulled high, high up off the forehead. An elaborate miniature still life was frequently added, one around a theme to express a feeling or to commemorate an event. The one on your right commemorates a naval victory. And finally, the entire thing was doused with powder. The one on the left is the painting of an actual hairstyle, but needless to say, this led to great satirical cartooning, as you see on the right. Richly deserved. Bertine designed most of the gowns that Marie Antoinette used to try to improve her negative public image. You may remember that she really didn't stand a chance at royal success. First of all, she was a foreigner from Austria. She didn't produce a royal heir for 7 years. That certainly wasn't her fault. Her mother was constantly writing to her, giving her suggestions as how to seduce her young husband. But it turned out that Louis had some problems, some physical problems of a bent nature that made things painful. So it took a little while. But Marie, bless her heart, thought that she could use her appearance to try to create a more positive image, but this idea was fraught with problems. When wearing the fancy French Rococo fashions, as you see on the right, she was criticized for spending too much money. She loved fashion, and she often bought up to 300 new garments every year. But she believed that she hoped that looking beautiful and fashionable would gain respect. But when wearing the simpler cotton gowns, as you see on the left, the robe de la Reine, she was viciously criticized as disrespecting her position and, by extension, the king himself. Rose Bertine was responsible for both extremes of fashion design, and whatever Marie wore, whether criticized or not, it became fashionable. So by extension, Rose Bertine must be seen as an early influencer who helped propel Paris into becoming the center of fashion. She even designed the dress that poor Marie Antoinette wore after the execution of her husband. Now, Bertine was followed by a small number of designers to the elite whose names are known to historians, but are not well known. It's not until the 1850s that we have a designer whose name is well known even today, and that is Charles Frederick Worth. He opened the House of Worth in 1858, which became the best-known couture house in France, and dominated Parisian fashion for the second half of the 19th century. And you all know what couture is because Annette gave a wonderful definition of it on Wednesday. Before Worth, excuse me, dressmakers went to the homes of those who could afford it and did make clothes to fit more or less. But in couture, you went to the designer's showroom where you were shown a variety of styles. You made your selection, and then the dress was made to your absolute specifications. So it was beautifully, beautifully fit to you, and that's made a huge difference. Other dressmakers in Paris worked in this method, but Worth was an incredible self-promoter, and he is given credit as being the inventor of couture. He was also the first designer to put his name into garments. Now, he is known, of course, for his shop in Paris, but he was born in England in 1826. As a young man, Worth worked as an apprentice and clerked for 2 London textile firms, learning a great deal about fabrics. He also visited the National Gallery on a regular basis, particularly looking at the portraits and looking at those historic garments, which would then become sources of inspiration for his later designs. He moved to Paris in 1845 and worked for the prominent textile firm Gaglian, eventually opening a small dressmaking department within the store, his first position as a professional dressmaker. He contributed to the reputation of the firm with prize-winning designs that were displayed at those great exhibitions, such as the Great Exhibition in London of 1851 and the one in Paris in 55. Now, he did a very clever thing. He married the most successful model at Gaglian, and through her then showed off his designs and was able to open his own firm with a business partner in 1858. His beautiful French wife, and this is not the most flattering photograph, but it was the only one I could find, but she had a great reputation as a beauty. And so when she would wear his designs, people would come up to her and say, "Oh, where did you get that?" And of course she could say, "My husband designed it." And that increased his patronage, the width of his patronage. There is his shop, and the interior of it at a later date. It was open even into the first decades of the 20th century. And eventually, he was able to gain the patronage of such arbiter of fashion as Princess Pauline von Metternich, who was the wife of the Austrian ambassador in the court of Napoleon III. And this is it's how it works today. You know, he offered her several different designs for gowns, and she said, "Well, I'll wear that one, but I'm not going to pay you for it." But by her wearing it, that spread his fame. And eventually, then he became the designer for Empress Eugenie, the wife of Napoleon III, excuse me, and by extension then becomes the designer of France. At the height of his career, the House of Worth employed over 1,200 people and was known internationally. He loved American clients who had faith in his taste and plenty of francs. His sons took over the business in his later years, but he kept tabs on what was going on and kept coming in whenever he could to meet with customers. After his death in 1895, the sons led it on to even more success in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. But all of these designs would not have been successful if the time had not been right. Fashions are always, always influenced by economic, political, and social factors. New fashions do not just arise out of the ether. Worth's rise as a designer in the 1860s coincided with the establishment of the Second Empire in France. With Napoleon III as the new emperor, Paris once again was an imperial capital and the setting for numerous state occasions. Napoleon had a grand vision for France with changes and modernization that revitalized the French economy and made Paris into a showplace of Europe. It became the City of Lights with more than 58,000 gas lights established around the city. I always thought that the City of Lights just came from some more allegorical reference, but it's actually for the gas lights. New boulevards, gardens, grand buildings were all part of this revitalization effort. The Paris Opera House, how many of you have been there? Oh, you lucky, lucky people. I never have been inside it, and now I'm dying to. But the Paris Opera House, designed by Charles Garnier, is still a highlight of Paris. The demand for luxury goods and fashionable dress reached levels that had not been seen since before the French Revolution. And these are two of his designs. The Turkish trousers were to be worn to a fancy dress ball. Women certainly were not wearing bifurcated garments at this point. Now, the height of Worth's reign over fashion from the 1870s to 1900 was the Belle Epoque era of Europe, and it overlaps with America's so-called Gilded Age. And these were periods of great prosperity and relative peace marked by conspicuous waste and conspicuous consumption, as described by Thorstein Veblen. And Veblen is the one who put forth the probably accurate theory that it was the role of women in the latter part of from the mid to latter part of the 19th century to dress extremely well, to partake for the elite in that wonderful tradition of changing clothes 3 to 5 times a day. And the women were to do this to reflect well upon their husbands. Because after all, their husbands had been making all of this money in railroads, industrialization, and so forth. And the houses, and this is Biltmore, the houses certainly were part of this conspicuous consumption. The fashions of the last decades of the century and the outfits, of the couturiers of the time were extravagant, ornate, and painstakingly made. And these are both Worth dresses. Now, in the latter quarter of the century, this extremely interesting silhouette arose. This is the bustle period. One wonders now what was going on. Actually, it's fairly functional, because what had happened was that, you may remember from Gone with the Wind, remember the great big huge skirts? My students, by the way, have not even seen Gone with the Wind. The only kind of visual references they have to some sort of period clothing is Disney princesses. But the skirts had become so huge because in the latter part of the 1850s, the steel crinoline was invented. And Worth is given credit for it, but he did not invent it. But the steel cage was invented, which allowed the skirts to become even larger, because prior to that, you had to wear 8 to 10 petticoats to achieve that great circumference. Needless to say, that was really wearing on the body. And of course, added to your waistline, which you needed to keep very small. So the steel cage crinoline was a wonderful invention. And so you got to have these huge, huge skirts that became so large that you literally couldn't walk through the doorways or through a room without knocking things off. So by the end of the 60s, this gigantic width starts moving towards the back. So you move all this fabric to the back, and what are you going to do with it? You're going to bunch it up. So you get bustles. And we have 3 bustle periods, all very short in length. On the left, from 1872 to 78, with sort of this waterfall. And of course you have, but I restrained myself. I didn't put in all the pictures of the underwear, but you've got these steel garments, these wonderful devices underneath to prop all of this up. So this is just this sort of gentle waterfall. You can see after the fabric's been pulled back and been poofed and so forth, then it starts coming down. But we can't leave that. From 1878 to 1883, we get this straight princess look. And this version still has some fullness at the back, but some of the more extreme versions, it's a cuirass body. It's very tight fitting, and then you only have this little bit of fullness at the bottom, which reminds me of the mermaid look of today. Well, that only lasted a few years, probably because not a whole lot of people could look good in it. And then we went back with a vengeance. And this is the period that it was said that if you had a proper bustle and if you were properly positioned, you could balance a teacup on the top of it. And then it starts collapsing after the 1890. And it collapses pretty quickly as if the air had been punched out of it. And it collapses, and through the 1890s, it just gets narrower, and you have just this little bit of a bustle pad that's left. Now, there was one bright spot in these decades of fashionable restraint of women's bodies. Women had long taken part in many sports, but always just in their normal walking dresses. So here you are roller skating with all of these ruffles and long skirts. I can only imagine. I mean, I would have tripped, I don't know how many times, and ended up horizontal. Finally, in the late 1890s, the popularity of bicycling had made a breakthrough. You can see that on the left, originally women were only to wear these ride these tricycles, and that you could keep your legs covered modestly. Well, finally, about 1895, women finally got to wear a bifurcated garment, even though it was all puffed up or you had a skirt that covered it up. But a woman could wear a version of pants without being seen as some sort of godless heathen. So that was the one bright spot. But if you weren't bicycling, you were still restrained. And this is this lovely look. This is the, the curvaceous S-bend silhouette that dominated fashion up until about 1908. Now, how do you achieve this mono-bosom look? You have to have the properly constructed corset. You've got to have some padding in the interior of the clothing. And most of all, you have to have this awful, awful posture that must have been just back-breaking. But to be fashionable, and also the whole idea of this low-slung bosom, you could just wait for that, you know? So the first decade of the 20th century sees all of these incredible advances. Of course, you have the Wright brothers and the first flight, introduction of Model T. This image is actually from about the early 30s, and actually was taken at Stinson Field in San Antonio. You have the expansion of industrialization, which along with many other technical advances, created an atmosphere of many rapid changes in everyday life. And clothing does change. These dresses are on the left, it's 1908, in the middle, 1910. Now, these are both evening dresses, so I realized after I'd finished this that I should have put day dresses in there so that you could see that by 1915, the hemline actually was at ankle length, so it was moving up. And in addition to the hemline rising, in these first decades, actually it was an overall gradual release of the female body from centuries of restraint through corsets. Of course, it wasn't all loose comfort. You know, you get rid of the corset in the 1920s, but it hangs around for many years. And of course, in the 1950s, what was the version of a corset? No, that's the lower part. What was on the upper part? The Merry Widow. The Merry Widow, and I don't know why she was merry wearing that thing. And of course, you had girdles. And apparently girdles were considered a protector of female virtue. I have a friend who belonged to a sorority at UT Austin in the 60s, and before she left the sorority house on a date, the house mother checked to make sure she had on a girdle. That was going to prevent things from happening, I guess. So, I do think we seem to have slipped backwards in the last decades in recognizing the beauty of a natural body, since now one is expected to spend untold hours in the gym, firming and toning and whatever, and if that doesn't help, then there's always spandex, and I am sure that there are people who have died trapped in trying to get those bloody things off your bottom. And then, of course, there's plastic surgery if all else fails. However, we have Paul Poiret, who is given credit for freeing the woman's body by getting rid of the corset. And this is, he works in the teens from about 1910, 1908, 1910 to about 1920. The dress on the left is his minaret dress, and you can see that the bodice is very soft and very natural. There's no mono bosom here. He fashioned with designs that did not include one of those full petticoats or a corset, resulting in a more natural body shape. He worked for the House of Worth originally, but everyone was offended by his designs. So he moved on and eventually was able to open his own house. Between 1903 and World War I, he became the most influential designer in Paris in some ways, and then after World War I, that's when he became even, his fashions were more widespread. Paul Poiret, P-O-I-R-E-T, I apologize for not getting a proper handout to you. I was overwhelmed for many reasons, and I didn't realize how much I really should have done that for you, and I do apologize for it. And I guess I also thought, well, you're really only concerned with 1990s, so I sort of didn't worry about you knowing any of this. I thought I was just sort of giving you background stuff, and I didn't realize what good students you are. So, now, despite the fact that he took away the corset, he put women in hobble skirts, which were very tight at the ankle, which seems extremely unfreeing. But he said himself that I freed the bosom, shackled the legs, but gave liberty to the body. Now, the hobble skirt was only fashionable from about 1911 to 1930, and his designs continued to evolve. I think this coat in the center is absolutely gorgeous and would be happy to wear it. He also worked with many different artists of the time. He also worked with Ballet Russe, as did a number of other designers at that period. And the costume, the dress on the right is actually a costume. And there's another one of his coats, and with the close-up on that detailing. You know, of course, this is very much a kimono cut. And that's a whole other very interesting topic, is the influence of the East on Western fashion, particularly from about 1870 when Japan opened up to the early parts of the 20th century. This is my favorite designer from this period. Anybody know who this is? Fortuny, Fortuny. He was Venetian, and he developed this secret method of pleating silk, and it is still a secret. Now, Mary McFadden in the 80s found a very similar, she got a very similar effect with a modern version of it, but Fortuny is the inventor of these in beautiful pleated silk gowns. He also used all kinds of exotic dyes, including cochineal, and got these rich, rich colors. These gowns were made of one single length of silk, repeatedly dyed to get very, very rich colors, and then put through this pleating process. And they came in somewhat of variation. You had some with long sleeves with little buttons all the way down the outer sleeve. The peplum effect could be straight across or be dagged like this one is. They were perfect dresses for travel because you twisted them and then put them into a little circle, and they came in a little box about this big. So you could travel to Europe with a very few of these and then just have wonderful jewelry, and you were set for any occasion. He called these long, clinging, classically inspired dresses that undulated with color, he called them Delphos gowns, and they are absolutely, you can see the classical reference to them. Now, in the early years of the 20th century, many more women were going to work. Of course, women have always worked. But even sometimes there was a little bit of a choice at this point about working. Now, the women in the textile mills, in the picture in the left, women had been working in textile mills since the 1830s or 1820s when they first opened in New England. And at that period, they were the daughters of farmers who were about to lose their lands. But the daughters went to work and often were able to save family farms by even their meager wages. So women and children have always been the workers in textile mills. But in the early part of the 20th century, you started getting new possibilities. You could be a telegraph operator, or you could, with the invention of the typewriter. I love this woman at the typewriter. I don't think she's really working, do you? I think this is posed. And as soon as World War I started in 1914, they entered the workforce by necessity in ever-increasing numbers. And as always been the case, war affects fashion in a number of ways, from shortage of materials to new influences from afar. There were so many funerals, particularly in Europe, especially, and visits to the wounded, and the general gravity of the time period meant that darker colors became the norm. Another important change is in the length of skirts. Now, we think of the 1920s and the flapper as having the first short dresses, but that upward creep had started in the previous decade. And here is the design for 1912, and you can see, you actually see the ankle, which doesn't seem like much, but that was. And then fairly quickly, it moves up to bottom of the calf by 1915 or so. And of course, these increased working situations, all these times in which women needed a shorter length that was easier to move around in. Oh, excuse me. I seem to have left out in some sort of, in my cutting and repasting, I have removed a paragraph or two. However, this is talking about actually women working. And of course, they joined the Red Cross, and they also did things that women had never done before. And again, this picture on the right may have been a little bit for a stunt, but women did go into all kinds of work, from painting water towers to doing things that they had never done before because of the effects of so many men being away at war. And of course, women did join military groups also. And so this is a uniform. The one on the right is actually from England. But that uniform, the necessity of work, of being able to move about when you were in the military, affects the fashionable look. Now, the 1920s is probably the first decade that most people have a mental image of what women wore. And where does that image come from? It comes from movies, from television, and costume parties. I had no idea how many kits for putting on a flapper party are available on the web. There are many, many of them. Now, of course, the most important thing that happens is the 19th Amendment finally gets passed in 1920, and you have a whole different set of roles for women. You also have great prosperity in the 1920s. You have new inventions, well, not inventions, but all that prosperity makes it possible to have all of these advances, such as radios, and you can listen to jazz. And this prosperity allows you to go to jazz clubs and dance in those newly shortened dresses. Life really did change. The women, young women smoked, they went out in cars, they partied, they danced, they had sex, they always had been, but this is more openly. For one thing, there was a cure for syphilis, and parents were shocked. And something else that added to the illicit nature of the 20s is prohibition, America's great experiment, when it made it illegal to sell alcohol. But it didn't keep people from getting it. And of course, there were speakeasies. And women had not gone to saloons, but they did go to speakeasies. And that's where they wear all these wonderful new, very almost androgynous looks, these very rectangular silhouettes, even with new underwear then. Very simple. And cosmetics, makeup is allowed. And cutting your hair. This is a huge thing. Fathers, husbands railed against cutting their hair, and that's a whole other issue. So bobbed hair and those cloches. Chanel is the designer of the decade, and she is given credit for the invention, really, of sweaters and knitwear for women. She started this in a seaside French town, even before the 20s, and then as the 20s moved on. And these are all Chanel pieces. The one in the center you could wear today. That was not always that rectangular look, though. There was an alternative. This is Jean Lavigne, and these are called robe de style, and it was a very full skirt, but that's not what lives in our memories. This is the memory of the flapper that we all have. Then, of course, 1929, and the market falls. But the rich still buy fashion. These are Ferragamo shoes from the 30s. But most women, the first thing that happens is the hemline absolutely falls. You get a lot of cottons, but this is the look of the 1930s. It's Madame Vianney and the bias cut. And you get bias cut in everything from nightgowns to wedding dresses. You get a lot of sportswear starting in the 30s, and then of course you have World War II, and everything is rationed. Women go to work again. Again, you have military influence. You supposedly had restrictions, and of course the whole stocking thing where you would draw the black line on the back of your leg to pretend. And even though we had restrictions on the amount of fabric, these dresses by Adrian, they don't seem to be following those guidelines. You have patriotic motifs, and then you have the end of World War II. Women have to go back home, and here's Dior, the new look of 1947. That nipped-in waist, that full skirt, longer length. You've got to have the happy homemaker again so that the men can go back to work. In the 50s, you actually had, this is about the last decade that you really pay attention to designers. This is Balenciaga, Givenchy, and Balmain. These are normal 50s dresses. The 60s starts with Jacqueline Kennedy and Oleg Cassini. And then what happens? The dresses on the left are 1961. The look on the right is 1968. But there's been this huge change. And what leads to it? Is it civil rights? Are the murders? Is it music? Women's movement? Largely Carnaby Street is given credit for this new look of the short skirts. But actually, if you look back, you have people like the Teddy Boys starting in the 50s who had this sort of Edwardian look. And this ends up in design wear in the 1960s. You had the mod group, the very short skirts. Then you have the Rolling Stones down on the right adopting that look in the 60s. But Mary Quant is the one who is generally given credit, although Courrèges was showing very short skirts at virtually the same time. Of course, what the US is providing is the hippie look. And that's going to be then taken in by designers, by manufacturers, and you're going to be able to go to Sears and buy flower power. Or Pucci is going to design a designer dress that's based upon the little Indian garment the hippie girl is wearing. You still have classical dresses. These are beautiful designs from the 60s. You still have Chanel, but now you can buy it at Sears. By the 70s, you get this whole commodification of those looks from the street that had started in the 60s. You also have pantsuit. What would women politicians do without them? And here we have the end of the designer control of fashion. Remember the maxi dress or the midi skirt and the tremendous revolt against it. The fight to sell the midi. Can dollars and pressures prevail? Women did not want to give up showing their legs again. In the 20s, in the 30s, they dropped down again. In the 40s, well, you went back into the 50s with the lower skirts, but they were not going to do it by the 60s. So designers and their real influence from the top has now been reversed, really by the events of the 60s. And you have influence from the street. You now have tremendous diversification, as you see in your exhibit. You now have fashion tribes, and you can dress in any number of different ways. And designers now do find inspiration from the street. And this is what I think is the ultimate example. This is a runway show in 2016 by the French group Vêtements. These are hoodies that go for $1,000 a piece. So fashion can come from the streets, fashion can come from on high, fashion can come from anywhere now. And thank you very much.